I first became interested in Robert Colescott's work when I saw his exhibition at the Namdi Gallery in Birmingham, Michigan in 1996. 5 or 6 years earlier, I first saw paintings by Joan Brown and Roy DeForest at the Virginia Museum of the Fine Arts in Richmond, and I went to the Colescott exhibition because he was sometimes mentioned in relation to his Bay Area contemporaries, including Brown and DeForest. So the question of how Colescott's paintings relate to those of other figurative painters working in the San Francisco Bay Area after World War II has been of interest to me since I first became aware of Colescott and his art more than 20 years ago. During all these years of looking at and thinking about Colescott, it's become clear to me that he was a complex and contradictory person who was not always a reliable witness when it came to recounting the facts of his life and career. For reasons that were probably personal, he usually distanced himself from his Bay Area contemporaries. Nonetheless, an honest and careful consideration of his oeuvre will show that he had much in common with his colleagues and friends in the Bay Area. It also seems clear that the first generation of Bay Area figurative painters, including David Park, Elmer Bischoff, and Richard Diebenkorn, exerted an influence on Colescott early in his career, especially when he was living and working in Portland, Oregon during the late 1950s and early 60s. The height of Colescott's renown was in 1997 and the subsequent few years when an exhibition of his recent paintings was featured at the Venice Biennale and at 8 additional venues around the United States. Colescott gave many interviews during these years, and he gave contradictory answers when asked about the relationship between his paintings and those associated with Bay Area figuration. Joan Brown and I were friends. I occasionally crossed paths with David Park, and Sam Francis was a classmate of mine at Berkeley. However, I'm not part of the Bay Area Figuration School and never was. I just knew those people. The solution was to retain the spirit of the abstractions and give them another life by adding figures, at about the same time as Bischoff, Diebenkorn, and Park. It was timely to put subject matter back into abstraction. I happened to be up there on my own, and some people said I was part of the Bay Area figurative group. I don't mind that, because in a way I am. The freedom to work, to be different and peculiar, was one of the strong points of painting in the Bay Area. The first answer was provided to a journalist, and the second to Constance Llewellyn, a curator at the Berkeley Art Museum, where Colescott's recent paintings were displayed in 1999, which might explain why his response was more affirmative. For David Park, introducing the figure into his work meant dealing with subject matter. So Colescott seems to have shared or inherited Park's conception of the meaning of the figure. Sam Francis, though he was personally close to Park, was an abstract expressionist, so it's unclear why Colescott mentioned him. Generally speaking, Colescott was fairly consistent in downplaying his connection to the Bay Area figurative painters. I would say less so because I had left the Bay Area when those guys started to paint figures. I wasn't there, I was up in the Northwest. Elmer Bischoff was a teacher of mine, but at the time he wasn't painting figures, he was painting abstraction, as were Diebenkorn and Joan Brown. I think I went through the same process that David Park, Bischoff, and those others did, only I was off on my own. I know Elmer, and I knew those people that were the figurative painters, but I really wasn't aware of whatever they were doing. Whenever I saw anything like in a magazine or something, I'd say, oh wow, I'm sort of doing that, but in a very different way. I don't think that the way they developed the figurative idiom down there in Northern California would in any way resemble anybody's effort in the same direction in Oregon. As we'll see, there is evidence to contradict Colescott's claim that he was unaware of what Park, Bischoff, and Diebenkorn were doing during the 1950s and 60s. Colescott was born in 1925, so he was 14 years younger than Park, 9 years younger than Bischoff, and 3 years younger than Diebenkorn. He was 13 years older than Joan Brown. After completing his military service during World War II, Colescott entered San Francisco State College, where he took his first art class taught by Ed Corbett, who was painting Mondrian-like grids at the time. After a year, Colescott transferred to the University of California, Berkeley, where he seems to have gravitated to James McCrae, who was also painting hard-edged geometric abstractions. This early painting by Colescott is highly imitative of his teacher's works and reveals little of the artistic personality that he would develop as a mature artist. According to Colescott, it was James McCrae who suggested that he travel to Paris to study with Fernand Léger. Colescott brought with him a portfolio of abstract works on paper, but Léger refused to look at them, explaining that he'd once painted abstractly, but ultimately rejected abstraction because abstract works do not communicate ideas to people. Having traveled so far to study with Léger, Colescott resolved to work from the models and props set up in Léger's teaching studio. Under Léger's tutelage, Colescott produced works such as this, in which Colescott appropriated Léger's simplified mechanistic forms, abrupt contrasts, and non-naturalistic colors. Colescott's encounter with Léger would exert a profound influence on him, and Léger would remain an important role model throughout Colescott's career. Colescott might have learned a similar lesson from David Park, who also rejected abstraction and returned to figuration, and it seems likely that Colescott was aware of Park's work early on. Park's Kids on Bikes was included in the 7th annual Oil and Sculpture exhibition at the San Francisco Art Association, which was on display at the San Francisco Museum of Art from late February to early April of 1951, when Colescott was a graduate student in fine art at Berkeley. James McCrae was chairman of the committee that accepted Kids on Bikes for the exhibition, and another teacher of Colescott's, Glenn Wessels, was also on the selection committee. Kids on Bikes won a prize and was much commented upon, so it seems unlikely that Colescott was unaware of it. In such works as Kids on Bikes, Park turned his back on abstraction in order to respond in his pictures to the world around him, charting a course that many other Bay Area artists would follow, including Colescott. Even at the early stage in his career, Colescott was a participant in the art world in the Bay Area. In fact, works by Colescott and his older brother, Warrington Jr., were included in the 15th annual Drawing and Print exhibition at the San Francisco Art Association on display at the San Francisco Museum of Art from mid-April to early May of 1951, immediately following the painting and sculpture exhibition, which included Kids on Bikes. This is the relevant page in the exhibition brochure. So Colescott and his brother there are in the lower right in this exhibition. This is the, by the way, Louis Bunce, whose name appears just above Colescott's, was a prominent Portland painter whom Colescott would come to know well after he moved to Portland in 1957. Between 1952 and 1957, Colescott lived and worked in Seattle, Washington, where he taught art to middle school students. In Seattle, Colescott befriended William Ivey, who had been a student of Clifford Still at the California School of Fine Arts in San Francisco. Colescott adapted Ivey's choppy, broken brushstrokes from Ivey's abstract expressionist canvases and employed them in his own figural paintings. Colescott described these paintings as combining the gestural technique of abstract expressionism with the representation of figures. Park's paintings of the 1950s are often described in the same way. These ideas are a kind of integration of the direct and vital qualities of abstract expressionist painting with a personal statement about the human figure, thus linking, I feel, the free-moving, dynamic, abstract approach more directly with human experience and man's inner life. Colescott accepted a position teaching art at Portland State College in 1957, and the move led to changes in his painting. Perhaps not coincidentally, Colescott again encountered Park, Bischoff, and Diebenkorn and their works around this time. In 1957, just prior to moving to Portland, Colescott participated in the first annual Pacific Coast Arts Festival at Reed College, at which works by artists of California, Oregon, and Washington were exhibited, and many of the artists were present to discuss their works. Among the Northern California artists present were David Park, Hassel Smith, Jay DeFeo, and Roy DeForest. In 1958, for the second annual Pacific Coast Arts Festival at Reed College, Elmer Bischoff and Richard Diebenkorn were in attendance to discuss their works. And works by Park, Bischoff, and Diebenkorn were included in a group exhibition in the Reed College Faculty Lounge. Another work by Diebenkorn was on display at the Portland Art Museum, included in a group show of West Coast artists organized by the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. Several months later, Bischoff was again in Portland as a member of a jury selecting works for an exhibition at the Portland Art Museum. Colescott also had a presence in the Bay Area in the late 1950s as he submitted a painting to the 78th Annual Painting and Sculpture Exhibition of the San Francisco Art Association at the San Francisco Museum of Art, where it was on display from early April to early May of 1959. In 1961, a painting by Colescott was included in A Pacific Profile of Young West Coast Painters, an exhibition organized by the Pasadena Art Museum, which included works by painters from California, Oregon, and Washington, among whom was Joan Brown. The exhibition traveled to various venues along the West Coast, including Portland. One of Colescott's students at Portland State in the mid-1960s, Judy Hoyness, told me that Colescott told her that Diebenkorn was an artist whose works interested him. So there's no question that Colescott was indeed aware of what Park, Bischoff, and Diebenkorn, among others, were doing while Colescott was living and working in Portland, Oregon during the late 1950s and early 60s. Like many artists before him, Colescott became enamored of the natural beauty of the landscape around Portland, and he began taking sketching trips and developing the observations he recorded into full-scale works back in his studio. He wasn't after an exact rendering of what he saw, but the versions of nature that he committed to canvas were generalized, even idealized. In one large horizontal painting from this period, the picture is dominated by wide expanses of green and blue, the paint is freely applied in broad strokes, and the forms melt somewhat in an atmospheric haze. The works that Colescott created in Portland are actually fairly diverse, and it is clear that he went through his own process as he insisted, and yet it is not too difficult to find works, such as these two, that bear comparison with those of the first generation of Bay Area figurative painters, and Bischoff in particular. Colescott said that his works of this period are meaner than Bischoff's works, but that's not a word that I would choose. I would say that Bischoff, who admired the works of Pierre Bonnard, often included highlights that created rich and glowing surfaces, in comparison to Colescott, in comparison to which Colescott's paint application seems more simple, unadorned, and plain. Bischoff's paintings reveal a finesse that Colescott's cruder paintings usually lack. Bischoff's paintings tend to be prettier. This work by Colescott is particularly reminiscent of pictures by Park and Bischoff, for whom the nude in a landscape was a frequent subject. And it touches on one of Bischoff's perennial themes, human beings' isolation from one another. It's probably hard to make out from where you're sitting, but Colescott painted over a second figure seated on the bank. When such paintings as these were first shown, critics compared them with those of the first generation of Bay Area figurative painters. This is from Henry Seldis in Art in America. Few of Portland's young painters are concerned with the figure, but Robert Colescott has made highly personal statements in his recent figure landscape paintings which transcend the conceptions of Bay Area figurative painting as represented by Diebenkorn and Bischoff. Most recently, he has become increasingly aware of the beauties of the Oregon coast, which his best canvases project in a free and imaginative way. And this is from Carolyn Bullitt in Artforum. Colescott, at least the equal of Diebenkorn and Oliveira, has exhibited in New York and Paris and has had one-man shows at Reed College in Portland and at the museum there. It's probably worth noting that Carolyn Bullitt, who became well known as a poet after she divorced her husband and reverted to the use of her maiden name, Carolyn Kaiser, was a friend of Colescott's, so she probably wouldn't have made the comparison with the California artist if she thought it would annoy him. It's possible, I believe, to discern similarities in Colescott's and Bischoff's pronouncements about their own works. These are excerpts from a statement that Colescott wrote in 1961. The work suggests reality, and should, because most of it is based on what I see and what I remember. It goes beyond the common conception of reality, though, since my imagination seems to interfere with my expressing what I see with exactness and what I remember with clarity. This melting together of fantasy and reality may create a dreamlike effect, but I don't think of myself as being a surrealist painter because the work is not dream illustration. The very blending of memory, imagination, and reality, which has always been present in my work, is an intrinsic statement about time and in time, since the three phenomena may exist simultaneously or in sequence. And this is what Bischoff had to say about his own work 5 years earlier. It would seem that the mind, or some curious and secretive part of the mind, is given to an endless process of selecting out and hoarding memories of experience. These memories are not in the category of those that can be recalled at will. Rather, they are of the order of formless but potent forces that persist apart from conscious memory. From time to time, some fragment of the everyday world will, of a moment, make connection with one or some of these forces, and for the moment, the fragment and its surroundings will come alive with an arresting vitality. So both artists rejected a literal transcription of nature in their paintings in favor of a representation that blends observation with memory and imagination. Although his motivation for doing so has never been fully explained, Colescott's decision to apply for a fellowship at the American Research Center in Cairo, Egypt, coincided with his acrimonious divorce from his first wife and the beginning of a new family with his second wife. He was also looking for a change in his art, and the environment in Egypt seemed to provide him with the new stimulus he was seeking. He and his family arrived in Cairo in 1964, and he soon discovered the Valley of the Queens, an ancient burial ground about 4 hours by car up the Nile from Cairo, and it was this site that inspired his first Egyptian paintings. Among these is We Await Thee. Like most ancient Egyptian art, We Await Thee is a vision of the afterlife, rendered in the idiom of 20th century European modernism. In the lower left is a partial female form floating upside down in a doorway, perhaps suggested by the tunnel entrances leading to the tombs of the Valley of the Queens. Let's see if I can point that out to you. So it's this figure here. Various other figures, presumably representing the spirits of the dead, stand, float, or hover above. Colescott had made the mistake of believing that he would be able to obtain art supplies in Egypt, so he brought only his brushes with him. When he discovered that there were no art supply stores in Egypt, he had to scrounge around for the necessary materials, and a large block of ochre pigment that he obtained, that the Egyptians used to paint their houses, was put to frequent use and provided a dominant color in the paintings that he executed during his first year in Cairo. In these paintings, he turned a corner in his art, in the sense that his work would no longer be based on direct observation, though he would continue to employ the human figure. After a year in Cairo, Colescott went back to Portland, but he was eager to return to Egypt, so he applied for a 2-year position at the American University in Cairo. He was hired, and he and his family again departed in 1966. He shipped over as many art supplies as he expected to need in 2 years, and he switched to acrylic paint, since acrylic dries more quickly, and paintings made using acrylics can be rolled up and shipped more easily. His palette brightened considerably, and he sought to develop further the narrative content of his work, inspired by ancient Egyptian art, which employs a language of symbols to convey ideas. The title of Nubian Queen refers to an ancient civilization and was now the southeast corner of Egypt and the northeast corner of Sudan. The painting depicts 2 female figures, one black and the other white, amidst a swirling vortex of high-key color. Colescott explained that his use of color in paintings like this was symbolic, that the clashing colors convey the sense that there are forces or presences coming into conflict on the canvas. And since the figures are painted black and white, rather than with colors that better approximate flesh tones, the figures might personify whiteness and blackness. Colescott's friend, the artist Joe Lewis, commented that Colescott's principal subject was the confrontation between white and black, in which case Nubian Queen is an expression of his major theme. The painting relates to Bay Area figuration in its description of the figures using the broad, sweeping strokes employed by the abstract expressionists. Colescott and his family were forced to flee Egypt when the Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt broke out in 1967. After several years in Paris, Colescott returned to California alone in 1970 and soon embarked on the series of paintings that would eventually earn him a national reputation. Like Nubian Queen, Pancho Villa depicts a confrontation between light-skinned and dark-skinned individuals. But Colescott has employed the visual language of cartoons, of which he had been an avid reader as a child. Throughout the 1970s, he would create paintings that deconstruct and satirize the racist myths with which he grew up. Colescott's paintings of the 1970s express an irreverent and iconoclastic attitude, which he shared with other maverick artists of the second generation of Bay Area figurative painters, like Joan Brown and Roy DeForest, who happened to be among his friends. Colescott's reluctance to admit the connection between his works and those of the figurative painters in the San Francisco Bay Area after World War II might be the result of his bitterness at having been passed over for a job at the University of California, Berkeley during the late 1970s. According to Colescott's friend and colleague, George Lloyd, Elmer Bischoff did not care for Colescott's paintings of the 1970s and probably played a role in denying Colescott the job. Generally speaking, artists prefer to think of themselves as individuals, and Colescott created a body of work that was distinctly his own. And yet, it would be difficult to deny that he played a part in the artistic movement away from abstraction after World War II, known as Bay Area figuration, which was initiated by David Park. Thank you very much.